I'm Jesse Berger. Thank you for joining us tonight. I'm the founder and artistic director of Red Bull Theater, and I'm very pleased to be moderating tonight's discussion on Tilting at Windmills, Cervantes, Shakespeare, and the Cultural Significance of Don Quixote. This is the first part of our Hispanic Golden Age Classics series this year, and it's centered around our live and live-streamed reading of Guillén de Castro's Don Quixote, which is being performed this coming Monday, October 2nd at Repertorio Español. These events are presented, they're sponsored by the Spain USA Foundation, and they're presented in partnership with our wonderful partners, UCLA's Diversifying the Classics initiative and Repertorio Español. We have some true experts this evening joining us to discuss Cervantes, Castro, Shakespeare, and their respective takes on the most famous would-be knight in all of Spanish and English literary history. We'll also be taking questions from the live online audience. So if you have any, please type them into your chat on YouTube or Facebook, and our host behind the scenes, Nathan Winkelstein, our Associate Artistic Director, will be populating them for us to answer as many as we can get to. So please don't be shy and put in as many questions as you have. Without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce you to our panelists for this evening's discussion. We have Barbara Fuchs. I hope we've been having some technical difficulties, so I hope we'll be able to see and hear Barbara. We're going to give it a try. So here comes, I think, Barbara Fuchs, a distinguished professor of Spanish and English at UCLA. She's the founder and director of Diversifying the Classics initiative, which has been working to promote Hispanic classical theater since 2014. Can you say hello, Barbara?
I can say hello. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Terrific.
Marvelous.
You're here. Good to see you again. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for helping make this possible again this year. This is a wonderful partnership. I think it's our fourth year doing it. But it'll be our first year doing the reading actually live and in person, as well as live stream. So that's particularly thrilling. Also joining us today is Associate Professor of Spanish at Colorado Mesa University and founding member of Diversifying the Classics, Laura Munoz. Hello, Laura. Good to see you. And we can hear you too. Terrific. Welcome, welcome. And Dr. Robin Kello, another member of Diversifying the Classics, who's currently teaching at Seton Hall University and Princeton University. Hello, Robin.
Hello, everyone.
Welcome, welcome. And finally, last but certainly not least, Rafael Sánchez, Executive Artistic Director of our delightful partner, terrific theatrical partner, Repertorio Español.
Hello, everyone.
Hello, Rafael. Well, hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us and joining this conversation and being part of this series on the Hispanic Golden Age Classics with us. I'll just dive in. I've got a few questions, and then we'll just see where the conversation goes and what our audience wants to hear as well. So I would love to start, Laura, if you don't mind, I'll start with you by asking you a question about how this particular play came to be. If you could speak a little bit about what you know about the original process for Castro in adapting Cervantes and his work to create the play Don Quixote.
Yeah, of course. So Guillén de Castro, a playwright who was a contemporary, more or less, of Shakespeare, so active in the 1560s to the 1620s, loved to rewrite existing works. It was one of his specialties. So we actually have a few examples of this. For instance, El Romance del Mío Cid, which is a very famous epic poem from Spain, he redid in two parts, so two plays, one of which, the first part, became the basis for Corneille's Le Cid, in French. So he was adapting and adapted, and it was pretty quickly after the first novel was published that we think that this play started being written. It was published with his first collection of plays. Usually you would have 12 plays and then do a publication, and that first publication I think is from 1615 or so. So as you can see, if the first part of the novel was written in 1605, it was probably really quickly put together for the stage, although we don't have exact dates for when that was done. And he very astutely also borrowed some of the printing images. So one of our images for this event actually is Quixote tilting at windmills, which is from one of the publications of the novel, but also borrowed for the publication of the play itself.
Oh, that's so interesting. And if I can jump from there to Barbara, perhaps you could just tie a knot from that, or a string from that, to the Shakespearean part of it, and how this particular chapter resonated so powerfully on both sides of the pond, if you will, in terms of things like Cardenio and of course the Don Quixote that we're talking about.
And The Night of the Burning Pestle.
And thank you, of course, The Night of the
Not to
Burning
be
Pestle.
forgotten.
Yeah, we had a wonderful run with last spring. Thank you.
So there's an amazing coincidence around the publication of Don Quixote. That's the year that the English send an embassy to Madrid to try to secure the peace for the long war with Spain, which at that point has been going on for almost 17 years. And so this embassy is in Madrid as Don Quixote is being published. And so we have Don Quixote being brought to the Bodleian at Oxford in 1605. So it crosses very, very early. It's also a text that is incredibly popular in Spain. Within months of its publication, people are in accounts of festivities and so on, comparing knights to Don Quixote. So we have evidence of widespread readership very, very early. We have multiple editions already in 1605. So the text is being read and circulating really widely. And I think uniquely for something like this, we have evidence of its arrival in England very early. So Night of the Burning Pestle, one kind of version of Don Quixote, very, very slapstick, very Englished version of that story. And in the much debated Cardenio, a possible Shakespeare-Fletcher collaboration, which we do not have, although we have a possible redaction in Tebbald's 1728, I think it is,
Right.
Double Falsehood. That what's interesting is that play, as Tebbald renders it, seems to focus on exactly the same story from part one of the novel as Guillén de Castro's play does. And so one of the things that's really interesting, Laura was talking about how canny Guillén de Castro is in picking up on the images of the Don Quixote publication as part of selling his play. Even the title is part of that canniness, right? He doesn't call it Lucinda and Fernando and Dorotea and Cardenio. He doesn't call it Cardenio. He calls it, Don Quixote, because he is trying to ride on that tremendous popularity of the Don Quixote figure, even though for a playwright, the really juicy story is the story not just of the love triangle, but really quadrangle between these figures. So it's really interesting that on both sides of the channel, the playwrights pick up on this story, which really doesn't happen to Don Quixote. He's a spectator. He runs across it. He intervenes or doesn't in various ways, but mostly he is on the sidelines to this incredibly dramatic, over-the-top story of young lovers. And so there's something very interesting dramatically in terms of that tension between harnessing the interest of this figure. He is the great sort of comic shtick on the stage, as in the novel and so on, and managing that with telling the story of these lovers, a story where the stakes are quite high, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating. And I have to ask, this is maybe a naive question that I should know the answer to, but when I think about Shakespeare and Spaniards, I can't help but also ask about Don Armado and where he falls in this. Is he after Don Quixote, or is he just a cliche Spaniard to the Englishman?
So the cliche of the Spaniard as the boasting soldier is much larger than Don Quixote, and it's an image of Spain that the Italians are very busily circulating, really, since at least the sack of Rome in the 1520s. So you don't need to go to Don Quixote to end up with that sense of what a Spaniard is in the English imagination or even in the European imagination.
Okay, thank you for answering that question. Rafael, I'd love to ask you a question if you could take the next one, which is, I know part of the answer already, because I'm sure, I know from your body of work that Repertorio Español has done versions of Don Quixote before, and you have one in the repertory now, I believe. But have you ever dealt with Guillén de Castro's version? And can you speak to a little bit to what its popularity is here and in Spain?
Well, not that I know. We haven't ever worked with Guillén de Castro, and that's something that it's amazing when Barbara and you from Red Bull Theater, suggested this collaboration. I thought it was very interesting for us because, Cervantes and Quixote is like the masterpiece of Hispanic literature, but there are not that many theatrical versions or adaptations or plays inspired in the work of Cervantes, other than of La Mancha that we all know. So it was very interesting for us to explore this version of Guillem de Castro, and honestly, it's been great to revisit the story, especially because the adaptation that we are working right now at Repertorio, the one that is available for all the audiences and the students that they come to see the performance of the adaptation of Don Quixote. It's an adaptation that was made by a Colombian group, directed by Jorge Alitriana, and it's very interesting because it talks about the less well-known episodes in Quixote, which I love. But at the same time, bringing this story to the stage at Repertorio is not necessarily about Quixote, but about one of the stories, one of the 100 stories that we say that we know at Quixote. So I'm very happy about this collaboration, and I'm very happy that we are able to present it both in English and in Spanish.
That's fascinating. Robin, could you perhaps speak a little bit to the process of translation and what the process of diversifying the classics is?
Yes, of course. So everybody always imagines that our process as collective translation involves this, these incredible moments of conflict and haggling over every little word. But the truth is we're extraordinarily fortunate, and I think we've sort of really tapped into a translation process that is suited to the work that we do, and that we're all coming from different backgrounds, native languages, historical expertise, interest in different kinds of literature, relationships to the canon, both in political and in literary terms. And so what we end up with is this incredible, I mean, it almost seems too pat to say, but diversity of translation processes all coming together at the same table. And then, it belongs to the group. We allow it to play out the way that it does, and we put it through different stages, different levels, and we read it out loud, and then by the end, often we don't know who even did which part. We're just happy that we all did it, except for when there's a list of lots of adjectives and insults, and if I was part of that, I'm really proud of that. But otherwise, we just forget who did which part. So there you go.
Well, they're wonderful translations, and it's such a service to the English-speaking community to be able to hear plays like this that we didn't even know existed, and to hear them in English for the first time. And so, all of us at Red Bull, I know our audience is particularly excited to hear this play. And maybe, I don't know, Barbara, maybe you could speak, or anyone at all who'd like to speak. Well, let me stop here before I ask another question to remind our online audience that you can ask questions too of these remarkable, talented, smart people. So if you have a question, please post it in your whatever you're looking at, YouTube or Facebook, post it in there, ask a question, and we will happily dive in and answer it. I wonder if we could talk about any differences we have between we'll say the Don Quixote that we know from popular culture and from Impossible Dream, and in this story, and dig a little deeper into what the differences are in this play and this episode. I loved what you were saying, Barbara, about how he's living kind of beside the lover's plot, which is really interesting. And when I think about the last experience I had with Don Quixote was actually a Terry Gilliam's movie, which is pretty wonderful, but it's very different, and there's so many different iterations. So I'd love if we could just explore some of the differences that Castro, what did Castro focus on, de Castro?
I can jump in on that. And one thing you should know is that I have way too much information. Actually, Guillem de Castro was the focus of my dissertation, so I've done a lot of research in this area. But one of the things that's interesting is that you're taking what is essentially a story told piecemeal over the course of 13 chapters and condensing it into one 3-act play that's about 3,000 lines long. And so the protagonism of Don Quixote is necessarily put into the background, but that's also coming from the novel itself. So that's not that different, right? Another thing that is a little bit different in terms of, and it was really cleverly thought out actually, this play, because you have the story being told to Quixote and Sancho by different characters in sort of a very bits and pieces here and there until at the end he meets all the characters who are involved in the story. Whereas here, because you have the kind of central focus being the lovers, instead we have, in order to kind of replicate this being like learning bits at a time, you have characters on stage kind of spying on each other constantly. And so while the characters might not know the whole story, they're learning kind of bits and pieces. The audience gets an insight into everything that's happening. And so it kind of reflects the novel, but at the same time does something different with it, which is really interesting. I would say Quixote himself is it's actually really funny, and Barbara loves this line, where we have a stage direction that when Quixote first comes out, it says, as described in the novel, which is really great. But Quixote also has some more raunchy lines. So he has a really serious flirtation with some of the women in, I think, Act 2 it is. And we don't normally see him as a sexual being, but this Quixote gives you the possibility to do that, which is, I think, a lot of fun.
He's younger than we picture him, right? I mean, normally we imagine him.
Yeah, he's only 50. That's pretty young, I think.
I have to agree with that.
50 in 1605 is not the same as 50 today, Jesse. So, but there's also
young.
I think the questions of the construction that Laura's alluding to are super interesting, right? Because the story is so fragmented in the novel, and that's on purpose, because part of the question is, it's a sort of he said, she said, right? And what are different characters, and particularly different genders, thinking about what has transpired. And it's not just a question of gender, it's also a question of class and relative power. And people have very different experiences of these amorous and erotic exchanges. They have a very different sense of what friendship means to Cardenio and to Fernando, which is what the Marqués is called in the novel. And there's a dramatic process of sort of untangling all that and rendering it in a continuity that would make sense on the stage, which is a really complicated process. And Laura has written about that in great detail. It's interesting that when Gregory Doran did a version of Cardenio based on double falsehood at the RSC, what was it, like 2008, 2009, they found that they needed to add some scenes because the fragmented quality of the text as Tybalt had rendered it in double falsehood wasn't quite enough to follow the story. And so it's a really interesting instance, I think, of this other kind of translation between the novel and the stage. And there is, as I said earlier, right, that tension between the slapstick of Don Quixote. I can't wait to see what you've done with him, and see him rendered on the stage. And this really these life and death stories for the lovers.
I also think that there's something that is not just a necessary shift in tone, but almost sort of like a narrative connective tissue that the reappearance of Sancho and Quixote gives us, where they are trying to make sense of this story that is incredibly intense, entirely improbable, very strange, and I think not just to our modern sensibilities, but also to the time, problematic in the gender politics and class politics. And so I think what ends up happening is that Quixote and Sancho kind of help us through the narrative, whether that be a literary or a theatrical narrative, by giving us, a different set of it's a different pair of theatrical consciousnesses that is trying to make sense of what's going on. And they're not making sense of it in a way that really it makes sense. They can't make sense of it because A, the story itself is so absurd, but B, they themselves are limited in the ways that they're limited in making sense of it. But I think the audience needs that, both in the novel and in the play. And it kind of allows us to remain part of the story without, I think, as Barbara was saying about Gregory Doran, it's like without sort of saying like, well, the story doesn't work this way. We need a little help through it. I think Quixote and Sancho give us that help through it.
I like to see this play like literally a play, and I think that sometimes we try to marry the play with the novel, but I feel at some point that this is the classic structure of a golden age play where there are confusions that, we're talking about honor, we're talking about family status and relationships between the characters, and then suddenly Quixote and Sancho are there. Like it's like they appear to make the audience understand or love or whatever about the story that is happening. But I see the connections with obviously the story from Quixote from the novel, but I try to analyze it as a theatrical play from the golden age, because honestly my feeling is that, obviously there are many references of El Cid, there are many references about, but I feel that these two characters were so well known between the first novel of Quixote and the second one, and it was very well known for the, I guess at that point, Spaniard audience about Quixote and Sancho, that bringing them to the story was useful, but at the same time it's a comedy. It's like the comedy of errors, like the I'm not your son, I'm his son, like so many things that dramatically work as a play.
That's really interesting, and it goes to one of the questions that's come in online. Perhaps, if any of you feel this, I'm not gonna say the name because I'll mispronounce it terribly. So I'll just read the question: is the title a little misleading for lay audiences who want to see the story of Don Quixote as they read it or know it somehow?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Straight answer, yes.
Yeah. It's like Barbara was saying, Guillén de Castro is a man who knew how to market himself, I would say. And he's actually really interesting because he kept control of the publication of his own plays. He was really interested in making sure that he was the one that was putting these texts through the printing press. So, which is not typical of the time. We think of authors having kind of total control over their property, which was definitely not the case at that time and definitely isn't the case now. And what is really interesting is that this play might have started off as a different play. So the very last line is kind of wrapping it up, and usually they'll repeat the title, and Rafael has probably seen this before, right, in the ending verses. And this one, they call it Don Quixote de la Mancha y los hijos trocados. So the story of Don Quixote de la Mancha and the sons switched at birth. So there are some scholars who believe that this story might have started off as a switched at birth story that then was maybe Castro read Quixote and was like, oh, this is perfect. It fits kind of the story that I wasn't able to kind of figure out. And so now I'm going to superimpose Don Quixote onto this existing play. Although this is all speculation still, it is pretty interesting to think that the main focus of the play itself is not Quixote, but he is the main selling point. So it is, I think, a very masterful marketing trick.
Yes. Good. Well, here, another question is popping up on your screen from Barbara Simerka. I'll read it out loud, and you can think about who wants to tackle it. In thinking about why both Castro and Shakespeare, perhaps, picked this novella to dramatize, do you have any thoughts as to why this plot arc was more appealing than Marcella or Captive or Curioso?
So I'll let other people answer, but I do want to mention that Guillén de Castro also wrote a play based on The Curious and Pertinent.
Oh, thank you.
I'll pick up on that. I think that Captive would be the one that's most interesting to me because there are all of these questions about Mediterranean, interreligious conflicts. But I think that again, you're bringing it to an audience a love story, and I think also this is a motive to the Shakespeare question. This is where Shakespeare and Fletcher and Beaumont are really looking at these stories that are drawing from romance, right? And these romance things of, like Rafael said, like comedy of errors, like twins switched at birth, these incredibly unlikely stories. And I think that this draws very clearly from that tradition, and that audiences would be drawing from that. I would love to see a play if someone would like to write one on Captive. Captive is a fascinating novella there.
So I mean, I'll just add. I mean, I think the romance triangulation, right? The sort of I love her because he also loves her. Basically, the René Girard move is incredibly attractive, I think, in these plots. And I think that accounts for why second in your list would be the Curioso Impertinente, the story of the happily married husband who decides to ask his best friend to test his wife's fidelity. Old story, doesn't go well, not giving too much away. But anyway, that one is, I would say, second in the order of attractiveness. But I think it's important to say that there is a much broader range of Cervantes source texts that are adapted by Fletcher. I think it's up to 10 plays that that Fletcher takes from Cervantes' novellas. So the novella form is really attractive, and of course, the Captive's Tale, in a way, is picked up by Cervantes himself in 2 plays of captivity, and then Messenger in the Renegado also will take up that material. So I think, you know, one of the things that I tried to point out around the anniversaries of Cardenio and all the academic interest in it at that moment was that it's a very interesting placeholder for reminding us of just how much interest there was in this Spanish source material. Something that at one point scholars were only looking at dramatists using other dramatic texts as sources, and that would, of course, leave out of it all of this taking the plots of novellas as the plot of your play, which is much more Fletcher's modus operandi. So it's important, I think, to look across, not just at, you know, dramatic texts that become the sources, but as in the case of Don Quixote and the Cervantes novellas, also prose texts that become the plots for English plays.
That's really fascinating. And I'd forgotten about the Renegado. We did a reading of that some years ago, and it's about time it came back. This goes to, I think what you're talking about, Barbara, will allow me to take on another question that someone's asked. And I think, well, it is from Controversy Films TV, which is, can you talk about the fact that Cervantes and Shakespeare were contemporaries and how they might have influenced one another?
Oh my God, they hated each other. No, just kidding.
Well, I'll jump in. We have no evidence that they even knew that the other existed, or
I'm sure everyone in this panel is more ready than me to talk about it.
So what's interesting, as I often point out, is that we imagine that question as a reciprocal question because we live in a world where certainly they are equally important, or one might argue that Shakespeare, you know, has the much greater standing across the world. And in the period, it was not reciprocal, right? So Shakespeare, it's pretty clear, knew of Cervantes, hence the story of the embassy, the text of Quixote coming to England very early. That's not a reciprocal relationship. The Spanish are not reading English text in the period. The English are reading Spanish text, right? And it sort of messes with our sense of how these lines of influence go because it's so different from the way it is today. But in the period, Spain is really the center of literary experimentation and the sort of 800-pound gorilla, so that even in the middle of the Elizabethan wars with Spain, people are learning Spanish in England so that they can read these things that are so exciting to get to. And that's not a reciprocal situation. So it's a very different world than our world today.
But if I can add that, I think that most of the, you know, English playwrights at the age or Spanish playwrights, they were very influenced by the novellas that we were talking about from Italy. So sometimes it's like we see this like a confrontation between you were, you know, copying whatever they were doing. Maybe they were just inspired by the same things. And even nowadays, we still do these kind of things. Like I remember one of the best, La Venganza de Tamar by Lope de Vega. It was done by the Royal Shakespeare Company at Madrid. And I was like mind blown because the English people were coming to Spain to teach us how to do Lope de Vega, you know. So sometimes it's like, I guess it's the same situation maybe 500 years ago about, you know, who is the owner of this artistry, and I think they were inspired at the same time.
Rafael, I'm very glad you brought that up, because Romeo and Juliet is a wonderful example of this. I'm currently teaching bilingual Spanish-English adaptations of Romeo and Juliet, and I was telling the class that, well, actually, the Bandello novella, that is the original story, was picked up both by Shakespeare and by Lope de Vega, and again, Barbara and Laura know better than I do, but it seems independently. It doesn't seem like they were drawing from each other. They were both drawing from the Italian source text, and so this idea of literary cultures in transmission, getting us away, I suppose, from a sense of ownership or the authority of the author, back to where Laura started with this, was Guillen being very smart about adaptation, and how Shakespeare also, and Cervantes also, were very smart about picking up good stuff that's out there. Mm-hmm. Don't create from whole cloth. You can just totally take all these great stories, mix and match them, and they work. And I think that like this conversation is an extension of this very, very long conversation.
I've heard they do it on Netflix now.
At least they didn't have to worry about AI. What about maybe this may be an impossible question, but what about the Rafael? Your anecdote made me think about, well, what about the traveling players and across the continent as well as in England? How much do we know about what folks would have seen?
Well, I have no information about whatever was happening at that time, about the exchange of, performers at that time. I can tell you that at Repertorio right now, it's a whole exchange of people coming from every background. And it's weird when we talk about, the training in Shakespeare or in Golden Age or, Siglo de Oro and everything that we do at Repertorio. Because everyone comes from a different country, but at that time I have no information.
Yeah.
So the traveling Italian companies were very important for the development of the public theaters in both Spain and England.
Right.
And one of the interesting things is that in Spain they kept the model of the diva, right, of the importance of the leading ladies in those companies, whereas in England they went to boys on stage instead. So it's interesting when you think that they may have seen similar companies, but they still had to adapt them to the local needs. We know that those. Touring
somebody got a very important notification. Sorry, Barbara. Yeah. Say that again.
No problem. No. So we know that that model of the Italian companies and of the Commedia dell'arte was very important for both traditions.
I see. And does that? Do you want to talk about? Oh, here's a question. I'll save my question for after Gabriella's. Hello. I was wondering if you find that some of Cervantes' sense of the dramatic, as translated into his particular way of narrating, filters into Guillen de Castro's adaptation.
Yes, and I will say also that we joked about Cervantes and Shakespeare hating each other. There is indication that Cervantes and Guillen de Castro knew each other and liked each other very much. Actually, Guillen seems to have been pretty well liked by a lot of his contemporaries who didn't kind of see eye to eye with each other. So our famous playwright on the Spanish side, Lope de Vega, hated Cervantes. They were bitter enemies or frenemies at times. But yeah, I think it does. I don't know, and Robin and Barbara maybe can point us to specific examples, but there are some lines that are lifted directly from the novel. And so that definitely kind of makes its way in. I would say that the comedy is very Guillen to me, because he loved to have sort of interrupting scenes with like buffoons is a staple of his playwriting. But I do think that a lot of the DNA, the irony that we see in Cervantes does make its way into Guillen's work with this particular adaptation. And that might be because they sort of were vibing on the same wavelength.
Mm-hmm.
I think so. And back to the sort of how this is in some ways a story about Cardenio, and but also how those moments where we get Quixote and Sancho together, there's a sense of their relationship that is one of the central things to the novel, and one of the most, I think, both in terms of literary or sort of dramatic interest, but also just sort of emotional or kind of part of the core of that incredibly complex story is the relationship between those two characters. And I think that also comes through in Guillen's adaptation.
Yeah, and I just remembered an example. So at one point, like I said, the characters watch each other all the time. So you have Sancho and Quixote coming upon Dorotea kind of weeping outside of her house, and Quixote is describing everything that he sees, right? The castle and the maiden and the beautiful garden. And Sancho's like, you mean that hovel over there? You mean those like hanging skins of animals? So you do sort of get this like in very quick snapshots, like the essence of this relationship, and also this illusion versus reality back and forth that you see, and that is so kind of iconic as part of the novel.
Could you also expand a little bit about the poetics of piracy? I think.
Oh, yes. Well, I mean, this is, Rafael is not going to like this because this is going back to a much more contested model of authorship. So it's a book that I wrote on the uses of Spanish material in England in the period. And partly it was the book was making the argument that I just mentioned, that despite the enmity, the military enmity between England and Spain in the period, Spain was just an incredible, irresistible source for England. And the language that was used to describe the taking of literary material was very combative. So they speak of looting, they speak of pirates. There are ways in which we inherit some of that sense of the taking. One of the odder exhibits in this realm is into the 1950s. There's a Norton anthology of Elizabethan poetry that is titled The Golden Hind, and that's the name of Drake's ship, right? And so that sense of the connection between piracy, taking, looting, and English literary greatness is really peculiar when you start to think about it, right? Mm-hmm. And I think it's that sense of, not just Shakespeare as upstart, but England as upstart, or as coming to this literary development a little later, and having, again, perhaps because of the sense of being under siege or threat by Spain, because of the religious and military differences, just a very combative model for that literary exchange. So despite the fact that they're drawing on the same Italian sources, despite the fact that we know that there's all kinds of contact back and forth, the rhetoric of it is very, very combative.
It's almost like they had a war or something.
Almost.
This is really great. And Rafael, maybe you could speak a little bit about the reading that's coming up on October 10th at Repertorio and how that's being developed. And for those of us, we're two very different companies, but we deal in a lot of similar material with different languages. And I think maybe for the Red Bull audience and for anyone who's listening, it'd be really interesting to hear you speak a little bit about what's being planned for the Repertorio Español reading of Guillen Castro's play on Tuesday, October 10th.
Yes, I'm very happy to talk about that, and at the same time to throw a question. Yeah. Because, we have been doing a Repertorio, the regular version of Quixote that we have been presenting to the audience, especially the schools coming to the theater at 11 a.m. performances to get to know a little bit more about Quixote and the story. We have several performances at 11 a.m. So students come to join us and learn about Quixote, Bernarda Alba, in the time of the butterflies, several different productions. But this particular, collaboration, it's very exciting because Leima Lopez is directing the reading, and we are, I guess, addressing it as a Golden Age play, like a regular play where Quixote will be performed by our Quixote and Sancho will be performed by our Sancho. And it's something that is always very fun for me because I'm Spaniard and I'm the executive artistic director. And every time that I go at the end of the show to introduce the actors and, to have the Q&A with the students, I'm the only Spaniard in the like, I'm not even in the cast, but we have people from all the places in the world, which I think it's amazing. We don't take that, we don't pay that much attention to whoever people is coming from. So we are doing a great reading, and I think that you will all enjoy it. And at the same time, I'm really willing to see what Red Bull is doing in English at Repertorio. So whenever you want to come, like if you come to the Spanish reading, we will have subtitles in English or the opposite. I'm very happy with this collaboration.
Likewise.
It's really.
Go ahead, Barbara.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think it's super interesting that you have a Lema's Puerto Rican, right? You have a Puerto Rican director. You have actors from. Oh, she's Cuban. Okay, so you have actors from all over Latin America, right? Yep. And in that sense, that the plays are voiced in all kinds of Spanish accents, I think is super important. It's something that we always want to stress, and we one of the things that we're doing at Diversifying the Classics is recording the plays in Spanish, and we've launched with a Spanish company doing these recorded plays, but we are trying to frame them with discussions with scholars all over, and a kind of much more explicit discussion of the fact that these are plays that really bring the Spanish-speaking world together. And so it's exciting to think about the leveling that happens in your productions, where everyone is speaking Spanish, and the fact that there are different accents on stage isn't really getting in anyone's way, right?
And honestly, it's something that we have been working for many years. Like, I know that the company has toured to Festival de Teatro de Almagro, Festival de Teatro de Alcalá, and many other festivals, and it was very weird, especially for Spanish from Spain people, to understand that we can do a full production of a Spanish-speaking show without everyone speaking the same accent. And I think it's at this moment where, after what we're going through, it's important that, we are Hispanic, we're Latinos, we are not going, I don't want to cast all Spanish from Spain speakers to Don Quixote. Like, come on, it's just an accent. So we give it for granted. Like, believe me, there is no windmill behind you. So embrace the accent.
Well, right. And in the English-speaking world, I think that we still battle the demons in Shakespearean production of, well, should it, I still get this question, should it be in a British accent? And, and of course, well, even the British weren't speaking British accents when Shakespeare was writing. So what are you talking about? But on our front with Red Bull, we are also similarly have embraced the diversity of voices and backgrounds in the production of classical plays. And so it's fun to, on the flip side, on October 2nd, when we do our reading, we'll be so grateful to be in Repertorio's home with a wonderful cast of people from different kinds of backgrounds, directed by Jose Zayas, who's directed a few times for us. He's directed a number of Jacobean plays for us in readings, but he's actually never done a Hispanic Golden Age play. And I know he's had a history with Repertorio, so we're really glad to bring that relationship to fruition at Repertorio. And some of the wonderful actors who are joining us on October 2nd are Keith Hamilton Cobb and Geraldine Daughtry and Carson Elrod and Zachary Fine and Carol Halstead and Irene Sofia Lucio and Melissa Mahoney and Ishmenia Mendez and Jacob Ming Trent and Luis Moreno and Arturo Luis Soria. And so you can hear by their names the many different cultures, and of course, Don Quixote. This is a worldwide story.
Sure.
It's
even though it's Spanish. One of those situations where Cervantes will never pay attention, and we should do the same.
Yes, see.
And I love the mix of some veterans of our collaborations and some new actors in the mix, which is wonderful. I like that there are some returnees. So very excited to see their work on Monday.
I agree. And Controversy Films TV is, while we're singing our own praises, Controversy Films TV has also said a compliment here. I'm going to read it to you. Maybe Nathan or Jessica, you could put it up on the screen. It says, Red Bull, amazing work. Thank you. And great to learn about Repertorio Español. Teaching art of directing this semester, taught Don Quixote in World Lit class, and very excited to share it with my class. So thank you, Controversy Films TV. And I like your image, and we appreciate your interest in all of this. Thank you. Other questions? Okay, so it's 8:15 p.m. here on the East Coast, Eastern Time. So wherever you are in the world, you have 10 minutes to get your questions in, and we'll keep talking about anything we want to talk about regarding the Hispanic Golden Age or our upcoming readings of Don Quixote. And for those of you who are listening, please chime in now, or forever wait to have your questions answered.
Yeah, I just wanted to share a conversation that I had with a new director of the Festival de Almagro in Spain. And it's really interesting that in Spain also there's a conversation going on about how, in fact, the production of these plays can afford to be more diverse, right? The fact that they don't have to be done in a particular Spanish way, or, you know, that the relationship between the Spanish version of how this is done in production and what might happen elsewhere is one of equals. You know, there are many different ways of putting these plays on, or speaking the verse, right? That's always the big bugaboo. How do you speak the verse? And I think we are in a much freer moment in terms of, you know, not thinking about those things hierarchically, but really emphasizing the diversity of voices and accents and modes of delivery that will work for audiences in different locations.
And I think it's important to, you know, take the time to acknowledge that and just, you know, embrace that, you know, whatever work we do, we are not based on whoever or wherever people are coming from. We're actors. As long as we can do the work that we need to do, you know, and especially because I know I'm from Spain, and we are very classic, I guess, at some point with verse. But it's beautiful to hear these stories being told by people from other backgrounds. And I think they can grow a lot when they are not told only by us.
And that's one of the ways in which, you know, translation is really freeing. Obviously, you know, when we translate, we don't translate into a language marked by any particular place or time. We're trying to make it work for actors. That's really the key point, and make it easy for audiences to follow, which is why for us, you know, the moment when we finally get to hear these things in the mouth of actors is so exciting, because that's for us the test of the translation really working. And so as part of our process, which Robin was describing earlier, we never publish our translations until we've had a reading, until we've heard what actors can do with them, because it's really important for us to figure out, you know, if there's something that sticks or doesn't flow, or, you know, a joke that doesn't land. That's our real test. And so we really feel that it's a collaboration with actors around the process of translation.
And kudos to that, because honestly, the work that Diversifying the Classics have been doing I mean, I have to do it, but they have been doing such an amazing work for so long that I'm really glad for every collaboration we've had, and the work that you do is meaningful, very meaningful.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And we just got a question I have two questions about translations. One from Isaac Land, who noted that the great translator Edith Grossman recently passed away. And do any of you have a favorite translation of Don Quixote into English?
It might be Edith's.
Yeah, I would say for me it's Edith's, but I would also say, and this is mean, but take the time. Laura and Barbara know, everybody here, we love translation. Translation is so important, but I think the Quixote and the original is one of those things that it's really, really, really hard to do in English. And I would love to hear from Barbara and Laura and everybody else on this, but I would even say that I think that something like the Nobel Prize, Garcia Marquez, I think Garcia Marquez works better in English prose translation than Cervantes. I think Edith did an amazing job, but I still don't think it doesn't do the same thing that I can read Garcia Marquez in either and kind of get the same thing. Cervantes to me rings very differently, and I don't know what that is in terms of the temporal or the generic thing that's happening, but Cervantes on my brain really only works in Spanish.
I think it's a very complicated question because I've been teaching Quixote in Spanish, and I've been teaching it like a masterpieces of Hispanic literature in translation, and I used this translation. It's so hard. It's so hard because basically I literally had to learn new words and terms. Obviously, I'm not a translator. So it's very hard to find the way to translate everything. But I think Edith Grossman is one of the best translations.
Is that because, and I
So-
don't speak Spanish, is that because of the, like, translating Shakespeare? Is it the 400 years? Is that the main difference between Marquez and Cervantes?
Barbara, help me here.
So there's just a tremendous amount of wordplay in the original. I just want to offer a, given how many people there are in the United States who speak Spanish, a lot of Spanish or some Spanish, but maybe don't quite feel confident enough in their Spanish to read Don Quixote in the original. There's an amazing tool out there, which is Tom Lathrop's edition of Don Quixote, which is an edition of Don Quixote in Spanish, but for people who are not native speakers of Spanish. And it comes with glosses and footnotes and all of this kind of linguistic apparatus to help readers. And that's what I point my students to, who are not native speakers of Spanish always. And then you can have all the supports you need as you're trying to read this this more complicated text. The language is not that different from Spanish today. The sentences are right? So there's just like a different rhythm to it, and of course a very wide vocabulary. So, but it's worth the effort, and you could read your Grossman and then dip into the Spanish, for episodes that you love. It's very gratifying.
If I can add that for every English-speaking member of the audience, reading the Quixote in Spanish is not easy either. Like it's not something that we read like, you're 11 years, go read the Quixote. No, it's something that we have to study and learn, and so it's not an easy text, but it is.
Yeah.
It is and it is not.
It's a wonderful text to read in company. So if you can, sit in on a class, start a reading group, it is a great text to read with others.
Our reading group is the best. That's the best.
That sounds great. We can do this, and we can do Ulysses, and we can, we got to. I wondered if I can ask Lara. It looks like you're about to say something, so feel free, and I'll throw my question in case it's pertinent to what you're going to say, which is bringing it back to Guillem de Castro, and if there were any particular challenges in translating his play.
Oh, okay. So two different ideas. My first idea, I actually teach translation now at my current institution, and we were just talking about this today in class, that there is no such thing as a perfect translation because there is necessarily always loss when you're moving from one text to another. But that doesn't mean that the translation is any less than the original. It's its own thing. So, and Barbara will laugh at this because I've said it before, but just like my mom says, I love my children like I love the fingers on my hand. All of them are different, but all of them are necessary. So we love our translations in the same way, right? We love them for different reasons, but we love them all the same. And then your next question about what's difficult about translating, I would say the humor is always the hardest thing for anything that we ever translate. And I'm so thrilled to be able to be in the audience for the show next Monday, because I really need to know whether these things land or not. And some of it is slapstick, and some of it is wordplay, and I would say trying to translate so that the allusions make sense. Like it's a very reference-heavy text, as you might imagine, just like the novel was. That was one of our real challenges in trying to render this for a modern audience who maybe knows who Quixote is, but doesn't know what Cervantes writing looks like.
Right. Well, I can tell you as a theater practitioner too, comedy is harder than anything else, right, Rafael? Even in writing and in playing.
And honestly, I think that some of the most funniest part in this play, they belong to Quixote and Sancho. Come on.
Yeah. Well, we have a couple of wonderful actors. I'm sure in the reading and Repertorio on the 10th as well. We have Jacob Ming Trent is playing Don Quixote on October 2nd, and Carson Elrod, who's a well-known New York comedian on stage, a wonderful actor, is playing Sancho. So I can tell you that. Rafael, I don't know if you already spoke to the actors who are playing in Don Quixote.
I will be there. I want to see everyone at the theater. So please join us next week.
Yes. Any final comments from any of our panelists? And if not, I will. Or any final questions from anyone in the ether internet?
I was just going to say that this question of the humor is something that we think about really with all our translations. And I just wanted to share that summer of 2022, we had this amazing opportunity to go to Shakespeare's Globe and participate in their performance as research series, where you work with actors to figure things out about the text. And so we wanted to really think about how humor functions in these texts, the figure of the gracioso or sidekick, which isn't, present in the Shakespeare in the same way. And so we had this amazing 4 or 5 hours with actors working through a series of scenes. And it was extraordinary because some of it is just, actors picking up on the language and what they can do with it. But some of it is just actors finding dimensions to it that have nothing to do with language, right? That are all about this sort of physical comedy and the rapport between them on stage and so on. And it really takes on, another dimension. So I think that in Don Quixote, the physicality is front and center, right? Especially, as you say, Rafael, in the interactions between Don Quixote and Sancho, and just in Don Quixote's own physicality. So I can't wait to see that.
Even when he's swimming on stage naked.
Rafael, no spoilers.
There's nudity.
Don't worry, that's the middle of the show. Don't worry.
I think I'm really glad you threw in the nudity so that we could sell more tickets to these readings, attract more audience.
Not my intention, but I'm up.
Well, now we're going to have full houses. Thank you very much. We have just
next year. You can come back and see us for Quixote Naked. It's a special one night only show.
Now, I have one last question from our online audience, and then we'll say goodnight. It is Book 2 of Don Quixote has lots of gravity and seriousness by only focusing. Now, here we are laughing. This questioner is asking us if by only focusing on comedic aspects, such as those in Book 1, are you not at risk of leaving out a major part of Cervantes' vision?
Well, yes. And we have Guillén de Castro to thank and to blame for that. Yes. Because the second part of the novel wasn't out yet when he was adapting the play. It really focuses on the initial part, but we still have, as Barbara was saying earlier in the discussion, there is still a very serious kind of story behind all of this comedic slapstick, and the relationships between parents and children are very at the center, the relationships between people of different statuses, and the harm that can be enacted by people who kind of run amok. The Marqués is, I think, a hard character to like, much less love, and yet he ends up with Dorotea at the end. So the play does bring out these questions that are sort of heavy in tone, but not to the degree that we would see in like the second half of the Quixote novel, because, like I said, it didn't exist yet. And maybe it wouldn't have gotten as many people in the seats, so maybe Guillén wouldn't have adapted it even if it did.
It also emphasized what Barbara said earlier about our time in London, thinking about the figure of the gracioso and the comedy in these plays. The comedy in these plays is often sort of a Trojan horse for a real direct critique of the class structure. And I think that is happening even in these comedic sort of interludes in the first book of the Goethe as well. Mm-hmm. And so think about the ways in which the idea of class identity is being interrogated and really sort of the oppositional anger in a lot of what's happening on a surface level of humor.
And I think that at some point it's important that people understand that, Quixote has a lot of wisdom and a lot of philosophical thoughts that we are not able to portray them in a theater play. Like, this is a theatrical adaptation that Guillén did about one of the stories of Quixote. So he portrays Quixote and Sancho as part of the story, but they are not the main characters of the story. So I invite everyone to come to see the productions and at the same time read the whole Quixote, because there are so many other stories full of wisdom and learning that, it's not about we're leaving things out of Quixote and we're not helping to understand who Quixote was or the work of Cervantes. It's just, this is a theatrical adaptation of someone that was made in the 16th century, and we're presenting it, but we invite everyone to, get very well known to Quixote and Cervantes.
Very good. Barbara, any final words?
No, I think that's perfect. I think there's a really interesting question of what Quixote the dramatists are interested in and how. But that's only, as the questioner was pointing out, one of the many possible Quixotes.
Yeah, that's right. And we often get this question with Shakespeare production is, if you do one radical production of Hamlet, say, it's similar but not the same. The real Hamlet is still there.
Yeah.
We didn't ruin Shakespeare. We're not ruining Cervantes, and Guillaume de Castro's version of Cervantes' Don Quixote is his version, and we're excited to share it with all of you, and really thrilled to be doing this partnership again. I think it's year 4, Barbara, year 4 or 5 that we've been doing this, and our second time with Repertorio. So thank you, Barbara Fuchs and Laura Munoz and Robin Kello and Rafael Sánchez for being part of this conversation and for being part of our partnership. And to remind our audience online, we have a Red Bull Theater Revelation reading of Don Quixote on Monday, October 2nd at Repertorio Español. That's being performed live in person, and it is also available live streamed. And then the Repertorio Español reading is available in person on Tuesday, October 10th, also at Repertorio Español. Thank you all for tuning in tonight. This is Red Bull's first programming of the 23-24 season, but there is more to come. And if you'd like to hear more about that, I'll tell you now just a few things coming up on the Red Bull calendar. If you don't mind, we're doing a reading of John Wolfson's The Inn at Lydda on Monday. That's on Monday, November 13th at Symphony Space, and that's featuring Amir Arison and J.O. Sanders. And on Monday, December 11th, we're having a concert benefit reading of The Country Wife, William Wycherley's The Country Wife, as adapted by Maltby & Shire in a brand new musical, and that should be a great deal of fun as well. Rafael, is there anything coming up at Repertorio that you'd like to mention, or Barbara, anything you'd like to mention about anything coming up for Diversifying?
Oh my God, there is so many things going on at Repertorio. I just invite you to visit www.repertorio, I'm not going to be able to do that, repertorio.org. Visit our website. We have 300 performances a year of 10 different productions running at the same time. So you're always welcome. We have English subtitles if you don't speak Spanish, and everyone is welcome.
And, Barbara, this isn't fair to ask you online, but is Diversifying the Classics, is it a non-for-profit institution?
It is. We are part of UCLA, and we will turn 10 years old in January, which is kind of unbelievable. Laura was there at the start. Robin joined soon thereafter. You can look us up at Diversifying the Classics. Online will lead you to our site. Lots of resources online for people interested in producing or teaching this material. We have dramaturgy packets, study guides. Our translations are all available on the website. And please write us if you want to be on our mailing list, or if you have any questions, we'd love to talk to you.
That's terrific. Thank you. And since I know Repertorio and Red Bull Theater and Diversifying the Classics are all not-for-profit institutions, I will make a plea on behalf of all of our organizations that if any of you love the work we're doing and like to support it, you can make tax-deductible contributions at any of our websites anytime. And we thank you for tuning in and look forward to seeing you in person and at the theater and online. Thank you very much and have a great evening.
Thank you.